issues that are, in the newspapers today. Ferguson, why, is of course an issue. It's a bundle of really complicated problems and issues, and we're not going to answer the question why here. But what I hope you get in listening to our three speakers are some of the ways in which you can think about the issues that are embedded in what happened in Ferguson and what are happening more broadly in the country. And I think it's a really great thing to ask the question, why, and how can we think about it? We have three outstanding speakers. They each are going to look at this issue in different ways. Let me do it as it is on the screen, but we will be talking in a different order. Hilary Potter received her BA here from the University of Colorado in sociology, went on to do her MA in criminal justice at the John Jay College of Criminal Justice in New York, and then came back to do her PhD in sociology here at CU-Boulder. She's currently an associate professor of ethnic studies here. She works at this intersection of race, gender, and class as they refer to and reflect on crime and violence. And she's currently researching race variations in intimate partner relationships, both here and nationally. Our second speaker is Michaele Ferguson, whom I realize it's not the common spelling, but it's Michaele. Michaele has an AB in philosophy and comparative literature from Bryn Mawr, and then went on to do her PhD, School of Government at Harvard. And she's an associate professor in the political science department. And she works on issues of class, gender, and politics and government, how those intertwine. Our third speaker is Bianca Williams, who did her BA, MA, and PhD at Duke University and is in fact a cultural anthropologist. She's currently an assistant professor in the Department of Ethnic Studies. And she works on the emotional aspects of being Black and being a woman in the United States and in Jamaica. I think you'll find these three fascinating talks. Each speaker has about 15 minutes. If they go over, I will cut them off. The speakers will be mic'd. We didn't want to just transfer it for me. And then we will have questions from the floor and a conversation with the audience. We have the room until about 8 o'clock. So again, thank you all very much for coming. We will have 2 more social science forums in this semester, one on refugees and the problems associated with them and the problems caused by refugee status, and then one on income inequality and wealth inequality, which I think are 2 very pertinent topics. So keep your eyes peeled. So our first speaker is Michaele Ferguson.
Is this working? You're in the back row. Can you wave? Okay, good. Perfect. So my talk tonight is called the perspective color or perception color line. And my basic founding assumption is that we have a perception problem in the United States. One group of people is able to see race and race inequality, racial injustice. Another group of people is not. And the basic difference between those 2 groups breaks down in part along color lines. So let me give you an example of this as it relates to Ferguson. All right, so I'm sorry this is kind of small, but I'll try to explain what this is. This is a survey that Pew did in December after the grand juries released their decisions in both Ferguson, Missouri, and in New York City in the Eric Garner case. In both cases, the grand juries decided not to charge the white police officers that had killed the Black man in question. And what happens is when Pew does this poll, there's a dramatic difference in how Black respondents say that race is involved in these cases versus white respondents. So on the bottom here, it's Ferguson and New York. You see overwhelming percentages of Black people who say that a major factor in the grand jury decision was race. Those are the dark browns. And it's overall, it's about 90% of all Black respondents say that race is a major or minor factor. Whereas on the top two pie charts, you see much smaller quadrants for whites. As 33 or 34% of the population, the white population, saying that race is either a major or minor factor in these decisions. And then the light brown quadrants, those are people who are saying race doesn't affect it at all. Right? Race is not an issue at all. And so that's 60% on the Ferguson side. And on the Garner case, it's 48%. And then there's a much larger segment of the white population that just says, I don't know. And part of the reason why they don't know, Pew found out, is because they weren't actually following the Garner case. Okay? So there's a dramatic difference in how people, racially speaking, are perceiving whether or not there is a race issue at stake in the police shootings of Black men in these recent cases. So why do Americans see Ferguson in radically different ways? Why is it possible for two different people to look at this photo from Ferguson, Missouri, it's a few days after the shooting, right? And one person can see a group of white police officers who are heavily armed, who are aiming their rifles at a Black protester. And another person looks at the same photo and sees police officers who are trying to administer justice and create a calm situation in a city that has been racked by protests and rioting in recent days. My larger question here for you tonight is how my specific area of political theory can help us to think about this, about why people have different perspectives, why some people see race in that picture and other people don't, in order to help us to understand and ultimately to transcend what I'm calling the perception color line. Come on in, grab a seat. Okay, so first of all, let me just explain very briefly a little bit about political theory. Political theory is an area of political science where we study political ideas, how people think. So we engage in three different types of analysis, each one of which corresponds to a different research question. So the first of these is interpretive analysis, where the basic question is, how do we think? Right? How do I think? How does my group think about politics? The second set of questions are comparative. How do other people think? How else might we think? What other ideas are out there that we could have, but that we don't currently use? And the last set of questions are normative questions, right? Once we've reviewed all the different options that we've got on the table, what should we do? How should we think about politics? So these three questions are going to structure the rest of the talk. So if we think about the first question, how do we think? Right? In the context of the perception color line, I want to rephrase that question a bit and say, how does one group of Americans, some Americans, think about race? And in particular, for this part of the talk, I want to think about the people who say that Ferguson is not a matter of race. So this is a predominantly white group, and it's the majority of Americans. So they have a worldview, right? There's a worldview underlying not being able to see Ferguson as being a racial issue that I want to elaborate here. Right? So first of all, there's a belief that racial inequality is a thing of the past. It's something that happened a long time ago. We abolished slavery. We gave blacks the right to vote. We had the civil rights movement, and we now have the Voting Rights Act, although that's kind of been eviscerated. But we don't need to do anything anymore. There are no outright racially discriminatory laws on the books. That's all been done. So there is no existing racial inequality. So I like to think of Stephen Colbert here when I think of this particular point of view, right? He says, in his character, right, I don't see race. I've evolved beyond that, right? That's in the past for me. I just pretend everybody's white and it's all good, right? So what you see in this quote from Colbert, right, and then, the the joke works because there's some truth behind it, right? Like when people claim to be colorblind, oftentimes they're not colorblind at all. They're just seeing one color, their own color, white. And so there's a way in which saying race is behind us is a way of pretending that everything is okay, right? Rather than actually looking at what's going on. So that's the first aspect of this worldview. The second aspect is that racial inequality today, or any kind of inequality we see today, is not racial at all. It's actually about class. And this is actually a view that I've been surprised to hear really frequently in the class I'm teaching this semester on race politics from my undergraduates, including from undergraduates in college. So this is a view that I associate with Charles Murray. You might be familiar with. He's a conservative think tank intellectual trained in political science who's notorious for arguing about racial inequality. And his argument is that the inequalities that we see in America today are a consequence of poverty. Okay? So the kinds of issues that poor Black people face are the same issues that poor white people face. And so it's a misnomer to talk about it in terms of race. What we're really interested in dealing with is class. Okay? And so that's the second issue. It's not really race, it's poverty that's really the problem. The third aspect, pardon me, I've got persistent laryngitis, so I apologize for coughing into the mic. The third aspect of this worldview is the belief that success is a function of individual merit. If you work hard, then you will do well in America. If you don't work hard at all, then you're not going to get very far. You're not going to make any money, you're not going to get the right education, you're not going to succeed. And so if you are poor, it's because you're not trying too hard. Right? And my favorite person to go to here is Herman Cain, right? Who in the 2012 presidential election said, if you don't have a job and you're not rich, blame yourself. Right? So he doesn't want to hear Black people saying that it's racism that's keeping them down, keeping them from being able to achieve, because he worked hard himself and look at what he's achieved for himself. Right? So your problem is just that you're not working hard enough. Don't blame race. That's not really what the issue is. And so again, altogether, this worldview says racism, racial inequality is something that happened a long time ago. We're past that now in America. Today's inequality is fundamentally about class, not race, and those people who work hard are going to succeed. Now, the other side of the color line is diametrically opposed on all three of these points. And this, I think, is part of the problem with having any kind of real deep conversation about race in our society today in the wake of Ferguson and New York and Ohio and Florida and so on. So how do the other Americans think about race? So now we're moving on to the second set of questions. Well, first of all, there's a belief that racial inequality today persists and it has deep historical roots. And you cannot think about the killing of Michael Brown separately from the long history of the exploitation of colored people, the long history of white people engaging in violence directed at colored people and not being held accountable for that violence. So we have to think about this in the context of the history of slavery. We have to think about it in the context of lynchings. We have to think about it in the context of the period during the Civil Rights era and shortly thereafter, when there was widespread use of police and National Guards in order to enforce segregation, in order to stop protests, in order to curb civil rights organizing and other movements that were trying to do work around racial equality. So that's the first aspect of this worldview. We can't think race separately from that long history. The second aspect of this worldview is that racial inequality can't be explained by class. And so Charles Murray is fundamentally wrong. Now, when we think about the kind of racial profiling that happens in this country, right? It doesn't matter what kind of class background you come from. You can still be targeted and harassed. You can still be held at gunpoint. Right? So one prime example of this recently in the media is an essay by Keith Lehman, who is a professor of literature at Vassar College, who wrote an essay on Gawker about how he had been repeatedly harassed in Poughkeepsie, New York, a very well-off white town in upstate New York, and been threatened with violence by the police, and that it was just whipping out his faculty ID card that would get the police to suddenly start treating him not as a suspect, but as a citizen. Similarly, just in the past day, Charles Blow, who's a columnist for the New York Times, who writes about race issues among other topics, he mentioned his son, who's an undergrad at Yale University, was stopped at gunpoint by a police officer on Yale's campus as he was leaving a library where he was trying to check out a book, because the police officer thought that he might be a suspect in a robbery that he'd heard a report about. So being from a socioeconomically privileged background, being at a privileged institution, being on a university campus doesn't guarantee anything about your protection from that kind of racial profiling, from the potential of violence, right? If Charles Blow's son had done the wrong thing or moved in the wrong way, he might not be with us anymore. The third belief in this worldview is that racial inequality affects all people of color, regardless of merit. Right? So it's not about working hard. It's not about striving for the best that you can that's going to get you to achieve. Everybody, even those who are most high achieving, are likely to be affected by racism. Right? So some of the phrases that get used in organizing around the politics of race a lot, especially when it comes to this kind of profiling, are the phrases walking while black or driving while black. Right? The idea here is that the crime that you have committed that justifies the police in stopping you or in harassing you or even in using violence against you is simply being black. Right? And this phrase gets used in describing the case of Trayvon Martin, right, who was simply walking home wearing a hoodie at night. What was the crime that he did that made George Zimmerman think that it was worth getting out of his car and making sure that everything was okay? It was simply walking while black. There's nothing that you have in your power, right, that you can control that keeps you from being profiled in that kind of a way. So again, the worldview here is racial inequality has deep historical roots and it's ongoing. Racial inequality cannot be explained by class, and it affects all people of color regardless of their merit, regardless of how much effort they put into not being profiled. There is nothing that you can do short of staying at home that will, for the rest of your life, that will keep you from being a potential victim of this kind of racial profile. So given that we've got these two different worldviews that are diametrically opposed, right? Given that we have this racial divide in perceptions of whether or not race is a problem in the United States, what should we do? How should we think about race? How do we get a conversation going across that divide? Well, I'm going to give you some brief suggestions. This is all that I have to offer you, and I hope that in some way it's helpful. But part of the problem that I've been struggling with is that I think people who can't see race can't engage in that conversation because they don't know how to have there is no common ground for that conversation to take off from. And so a major part of the problem is getting people who are in that camp who do not see race to be able to see why someone else would see race in Ferguson, Missouri, in order for them to be able to take the other person seriously. Not necessarily in order to change their mind, but in order to imagine what it would be like to see race in Ferguson. So this is a concept called representative thinking that comes from a political theorist named Hannah Arendt. Right? When we're thinking about politics, we don't just think about our own perspective, but we try to imaginatively represent to ourselves what the perspective of another person would be. So what would it be like for somebody who's on one side of that color line to try to imaginatively represent for themselves what it's like to be on the other side of the color line? So here are my suggestions for how to do that. First of all, I think because there is this discrepancy over history, we really need to take it more seriously and make sure that we've got a stronger background in education about the history of race, that we're teaching our kids about it in schools, that's being taught in universities, that it's impossible to be an adult in the United States without really understanding that history. Secondly, in order to work that capacity to imagine what it's like to have a different perspective, I think it's incredibly helpful to read literature, whether that's fiction or nonfiction, that is written by authors of color, that has characters in it that are people of color, so that people who do not see race can imaginatively get themselves into a position where they may be able to understand why someone else would see a situation from that perspective. Third, I think a lot of people are afraid of talking about race. It's a difficult topic. They're afraid of offending people. And I think we really have to just acknowledge that it is scary and do it anyhow. And we are going to offend people when we talk about race. We are going to make mistakes, and that's okay, and it's worth the risk. But if we never have that conversation, then we're never going to be able to bridge that divide. And lastly, study political theory. Right? Political theory is the perspective, the approach that tells us how to look at different ways of understanding the world, how to look at different perspectives, how to make sense of them. That is one way that we can actually cross that divide. Right? By trying to understand, why does somebody else think the way that they do? What are the assumptions that they're making about the world? So that when we look at this picture in Ferguson, Missouri, we're able to see it from our own perspective, but we can imaginatively see it from someone else's perspective as well. Thank you.
Good evening. Good evening. Does this sound okay? Hopefully.
Our next speaker is Professor Hilary Potter from the Department of Ethnic Studies.
So I hate to start with an apology, but I have my laptop, I got my iPhone, forgot my iPad, and so I'm going to try to read my notes from here. So this particular talk, or this panel, why Ferguson, and us trying to give some explanation about the issues, why all of the national attention, the international attention around the death of Michael Brown. And several of you who are in here, thanks for coming again, were at my talk on December 3rd. Today's talk, since now I'm down to probably 13 minutes, I won't present very specifics on my research. However, I will be presenting several places throughout campus throughout the semester, and you can always feel free to contact me for instructors. I'm willing to come speak to your classes and for other events where I'm willing to talk about this, because I definitely want to share the stories I've heard, the things I've seen, the things I've experienced myself from the times that I've been to Ferguson. So 4 trips to Ferguson so far. There was a fifth one that was planned over winter break, but just couldn't make it happen. But I'll be returning there once a month, at least once a month, over the next several months. And that's one of the issues too, one of the issues, concerns I have about trying to make these theoretical arguments about why. We definitely can. However, as far as my research goes in Ferguson, it's not done. I have a lot of research to do. I have no idea when this particular project is going to be over. It's ethnographic, it's ongoing. As far as the individuals who I'm interacting with, I'm specifically focusing on women and who've been on the ground since day one or week one since Michael Brown's death. Some of them are new to activism. Several of them, particularly the older women, have been involved in activism before that. And right now it's a smaller so-called sample size because I have ongoing relationships with these women where I'm keeping in touch with them and re-interviewing them. But the hope is to interview approximately 40, 50 women. So as far as why Ferguson, I'm doing all this work. I am an activist scholar. I was already engaged. I had a new project that I started in Denver, where I'm born and raised and where I live now. So I've lived there most of my life. About a year ago on anti-violence activism. So taking my work that I do on domestic violence, intimate partner violence, and going more broadly with it. I've already done some broad work on race, gender, crime, etc., and all those types of things. It's particularly from a theoretical point of view, from intersectionality, Black feminist criminology, under those particular labels. But as far as my on-the-ground research, most of it happened in domestic violence. But I wanted to broaden it out and look at anti-violence activism. So I was already doing work in this particular area, and I had already had my own personal life, even though a lot of this is not separate from my work, where I'm engaged in trying to eliminate violence in our communities, whether that's from the state, whether that's that so-called term that many of us cannot stand, black on black crime, because we do not use the term white on white crime, right? So from the state towards each other, whether it's on the streets in the context of illicit violence on the streets, such as gang violence, whether it's inside our homes, sexual abuse, intimate partner violence, all different types of violence and anti-violence activism around that. However, with all of this, after this year, 2014, it's been a rough year. It's a rough year. We have a ways to go, and I mentioned this last week to a group at University of Denver at DU that a few days before that, so about a week ago, my 75-year-old mother, who lived, you do the years, count the years, she lived through the civil rights movement of the 60s. And to hear my 75-year-old mother say that it's worse now than it was then. Now it's in context, right? She has a daughter who has a PhD. So in that sense, no, I have a PhD. I'm at an institution where, a few decades ago, I wouldn't have been able to get a job here. But to hear her say that, and then for me to read all of the visceral language, or even the tame language, regarding when you see, in particular, the posters that a lot of us use in our protests, Black Lives Matter. Right? And so usually what you see is, oh, all lives matter, right? And the reason we do this is because even though we have those signs that say Black Lives Matter, in many of our points of view, Black lives really don't matter. And that's why we have those signs that Black Lives Matter. That's what the problem is. That's what all of the national attention, the international attention around this one boy's death is all about, right? Is that because Black lives still really do not matter, unfortunately. And it's all, again, it's contextual, it's relative. So my Black life, my experiences, yes, they're definitely better than Black women who are poor, Black women who do not have all the degrees that I have, all the letters behind my name, Black women who are not middle class, wherever I feel, I'm not still middle class, wherever I am right now, who do not match up with that, and the experiences that I've had, the education that I had, even through growing up in Denver, as opposed to maybe growing up in the South, the interactions I had. So a lot of different experiences. Yes, I have many privileges, but there are also many situations where my life, my own personal life, did not matter. And then I talked to many Black people. I read a lot of things, whether it's anecdotal, it's news media types of things, it's research, where we see the same stories over and over again. So Dr. Ferguson already mentioned a couple of these things here, right? And this is just continuing on with that Black lives don't matter, right? So oftentimes our experiences are disregarded, right? And you get these comments. It's not about race, right? You people get what you deserve because you're just thugs. I mean, constantly. And often, sometimes it's pluralized, other times if it's in the context of Ferguson, they're talking specifically about Michael Brown. We are often viewed as making much ado about nothing. Slavery was over. It's a long time ago. It's been over, right? Get over it, move on, and as Dr. Ferguson mentioned it, that we gave you this, we gave you the right to vote, right? Because that's how it was, right? That's how oftentimes the language is. We gave you all these things, so why are you still bitching, right? Why are you still complaining? Move on. You've got all these great things. However, again, we have recognized that our lives often do not matter. So the impacts of social identities and power dynamics must be incorporated into any social scientific conceptualization of crime, criminality, and the criminal legal system and its agents. Although there are examples of intersectional research and theoretical contributions to criminology regarding boys and men in particular, there remains a vacuity in criminological research on the significance of masculinities, gender, and sexuality, and the role of the commission of crime, violence, and other bad acts by boys and men. So that is just a brief quote, and I'm going to read a little bit more from that, from a book that I have coming out in May called Intersectionality and Criminology. The subtitle is Disrupting and Revolutionizing Studies in Crime. And that we have to start looking at these issues in a different way. And so it's not just the general public either. It's people in these settings, in these ivory towers, in the academy. But there are many people who think like many in the general public do, that one side that Dr. Ferguson was talking about, right? That there's not a race problem, this colorblind issue. In particular, there are criminologists very well known, continue to be cited, works continue to be, or their theory continues to be tested, so-called self-control theory, also referred to as the general theory of crime, by Dawkins and Hershey. And what they say is that all this race and age and even gender does not matter, right? It doesn't matter as far as engaging in criminal activity. But they also talk about not just criminal activity, but so-called analogous acts. And so from my book, I'm specifically focusing on that we need to take an intersectional approach. And so even though much of my book talks about the commission of crime for those individuals engaging in crime, it also talks about the criminal legal system and how we can apply this intersectionality or an intersectional analysis to not only criminality, but also to those agents within the criminal legal system. All right, so I'm trying to focus in on my little screen here. So a major theme, again, sorry if I'm repeating some of this, a major theme identified in intersectional criminological research on boys and men is that the research participants engaged in crime or violence in part in order to prove, uphold, or defend their manhood. Far too many studies within criminology disregard this indisputably important factor of gender formation and presentation in relation to criminality and other ill-fated acts, such as those, again, by individuals acting under the color of law. Research oriented in intersectional criminology, by design, acknowledges that both the man in the hood, right, and the man in the hood do manhood. So they're both doing manhood. And so that's the example that I'm using here, but it can also refer to, sorry if I'm a bit too cliched here, but to the man in the white collar, so in the suites, right? If you think of business executives, etc., as well as police officers, the men who collar others, right? We use the word collar to refer to arrest. So this concept of manhood and patriarchy and these other issues is something that we really need to think about when we're trying to solve this issue. And it's not just an individualized issue that we're talking about. It's not a one-person thing. We all interact in this society, and we all are affected by each other. And so we need to look at it more broadly than the individual aspect. Criminal legal systems do not operate, again, in an independent universe, unaffected by the mechanisms of the society and its social interactions. Systems of power, hierarchical identities, and interconnected identities traverse all lived experiences, and as follows: power and identity traverse experiences with crime and the criminal legal system, affecting all actors, whether they be offenders, victims, employees, administrators, policymakers, lawmakers, politicians, so everybody. Even members of the general public with no direct or significant involvement with criminal activities, offenders, victims, or the criminal legal system can impact how a community deals with crime, crime prevention, and the after effects of crime. So inhabitants, citizens, whatever we want to call ourselves, develop perceptions of the crime problem in a community and of offenders and victims from news media reports and representations. Oftentimes that's where we're getting our information. Many of these individuals vote on crime-related policy and law. If citizens, voting or otherwise, hold unenlightened and uninformed views about crime based on prominent information disseminators, such as corporate news outlets and social media. Sorry, this is really hard reading from this. Who share, so if they base their information on the news media, who share reports and crime reports that are not enlightened with an understanding of the effects of societal oppression on crime, we may continue to see no significant shifts in the way that communities and greater society think about crime and those systems put in place to combat crime, such as the actors within the criminal legal system. So and I mentioned this before in my previous talk, in my unstandardized and anecdotal reviews of statements on, particularly on social media forums, I often feel that certain segments of society have not moved far from what Du Bois said in the 1890s in his research on Blacks in Philadelphia, that there is a widespread feeling that something is wrong with the race that is responsible for so much crime and that strong remedies are called for. So in efforts to better control crime in the United States, officials have implemented a series of laws that have ensnared more individuals under the auspices, sorry. This is really hard to read from iPhones. I don't know how young people do this. That such laws would aid in protecting U.S. citizens and communities from violent predatory offenders. Unfortunately, a lot of these laws that have been put into place have placed many people, or keep many people who are already marginalized, keep them under control. And so I only have no time, so I don't have the time to get into the fallacy of neoliberalism, particularly Loic Bacan's work, but I encourage you to read his work on this fallacy, and he doesn't use this, I don't think he does this term, the fallacy of neoliberalism, but he talks about how it kind of fits with the whole post-racial aspect as well. Neoliberalism, post-racial, we're beyond this, we've moved past these issues of race. It is a colorblind society. Aren't we just a melting pot? Can't we all just get along? Don't all lives matter, etc. Right? And so he talks about, just briefly, and then I'll end. He talks about how these neoliberalism policies, as you can see there, hopefully, I know it's a lot of words up there, but let me just read one quote. This fast and furious bend toward penalization, and it's not just penalization within the criminal legal system, but it's within these other social systems that are in place. So if we hear about the health system in particular, and issues of sterilization and abortion, and controlling women's bodies in particular, issues around social welfare and government subsidies, and how a lot of the way that is set up, that is the way it's set up currently in this neoliberal society, is a form to control others. But unfortunately, I can't get that deep into it because I have to stop. However, when we get to the question and answer, if you have questions about this, or if you have questions about the actual research that I did, I am definitely willing to talk about it. Thank you. Actually, I will.
I'm pretty loud. I don't think. Can you hear me? No.
Yeah.
I'm from New York. All right. I'm not gonna
So our final speaker tonight is Professor Bianca Williams.
Thank you for having me. So I'm a Black feminist anthropologist, so I believe in using the personal narrative as
a unit for theory and teaching. So this is more personal narrative, but you'll definitely hear connections between the other two papers. How many anthropologists are in the room, or anthropologists in training? Okay, I just want to know so when I get the pushback, I know where it's coming from. All right. So last November, after weeks of traveling to conferences, and, oh, I'm reading because I will definitely go over time if I don't read. So last November, after weeks of traveling for conferences and finally getting to my sister's home for fall break, I tried to relax, to peacefully give myself over to the season of thanks. However, as I watched Prosecutor Bob McCullough announce the non-indictment of Officer Darren Wilson for the killing of Michael Brown, the protests and unrest in Ferguson, and the racial divide and conversations on social media, the break was anything but peaceful. I spent a day and a half trying to find an effective way to communicate the pain, frustration, anger, sadness I was feeling to my friends, peers, and colleagues online, particularly those that seemed to live in an alternate reality. It seems to me that they lived in a reality where various forms of racialized and class privilege, or at least blissful ignorance, kept them from seeing how racist institutions and a supposed race-neutral criminal justice system continues to oppress their friends, neighbors, and colleagues. I responded to student emails. I corresponded with students who were having a hard time processing what they were observing on the news, and I spoke with others who were trying to use the critical race and gender theories we were learning in class to engage in discussions with friends and families at home for the first time. I pulled my thoughts together and published a piece titled "Racism is Real and Colorblindness is Racism," where I critiqued the notion that race has little to do with the current period of extrajudicial killings of Black women and men. I argue that this desire for a race-neutral analysis of violence, death, and social inequality in the U.S. is unproductive and an example of colorblind racism. As families across the U.S. came together to celebrate one another and express gratitude for all that they had, many of us, Black and brown persons in particular, were mourning the deaths of members of our community. I couldn't turn my eyes away from the television and online live streams where the streets of Ferguson were ignited with outrage and tears as local residents and visitors protested, some of whom had been organizing social actions for over 90 days since Brown's death. Although I teach in ethics studies, my training is in cultural anthropology, and I was preparing to attend the national anthropological meetings, which were the following week in Washington, D.C. I was searching for how to make the meetings live up to its theme of producing anthropology in ways that felt relevant in this moment of physical and emotional unrest. This became even more difficult, but more necessary, as the announcement of the non-indictment and the killing of Eric Gardner of New York City was announced during the second day of the conference. Me and others affected by these recent events walked around the hotel lobby seemingly in a daze, distracted from paper presentations and casual networking, wanting to figure out a way to use our skills and expertise to do something. We couldn't continue with business as usual. At least 60 anthropologists, undergraduates, grad students, faculty, and independent researchers met during the conference to mobilize and discuss ways we could assist in what is now a national movement. Protests and other forms of social action were visible in cities across the U.S., including New York, Columbus, Ohio, Miami, Florida, Salt Lake City, Utah, Oakland, California, Seattle, Washington, and Madison, Wisconsin, even near our hotel in D.C. We created working groups, each touching on different mobilization strategies. This included making publicly accessible research on the anthropology of violence in police, utilizing ethnographic methods to support and document activist efforts across the country, constructing a section assembly statement that was later presented at the National Business Meeting, and creating a task force on violence and justice. Me and Victoria Massey, a graduate student from Berkeley, contributed our efforts to planning direct actions at the professional meeting and guiding anthropologists towards protests taking place throughout DC. We saw this short-term effort as complementing the long-term initiatives of the other working groups. While there were discussions about mobilizing outside of the hotel, we were adamant about pressing for discipline-specific accountability. We wanted to ensure that anthropologists recognized there were those amongst its members who were personally and directly impacted by the violence perpetuated against Black bodies across the globe in ways that could not be reduced and extended beyond the mere realm of the conceptual. We also wanted anthropology as a discipline to recognize its culpability based on its historical role in creating and maintaining an environment where Black lives are devalued, and we were demanding that it clearly state and demonstrate its active investment in destroying structural anti-Black racism. Many have emailed me and written in blog posts and articles that last year's professional meeting was the most relevant and rejuvenating conference they've been to in a while. Over 1,000 people attended our professional organization's business meeting, voting to successfully endorse the statement by our executive board publicly denouncing the disproportionate amounts of violence and death Black people are experiencing at the hands of police officers, security, and other forms of law enforcement. The Association of Black Anthropologists released their own statement. I will read excerpts from their statement against police violence and anti-Black practices here, as I believe it clearly delineates the role anthropology as a discipline plays in the perpetuation of this violence and the potential it has for helping resolve these race-related issues. Here's a statement. The Association of Black Anthropologists condemns in no uncertain terms the ongoing terrorism waged against Black U.S. communities by the state, police, and white vigilantes. We condemn the executions of our boys and girls, women and men by the police in Ferguson, Staten Island, Saratoga Springs, Los Angeles, and throughout the country. We also recognize that these forms of state violence are perpetuated against Black people globally. We are enraged by the fact that no police officer has been indicted in the recent murders of Aiyana Jones, Michael Brown, and Eric Garner, and we are outraged that in the 100 days since the murder of Michael Brown, police have also murdered unarmed Zell Ford, unarmed Tanisha Anderson, unarmed Rashad McIntosh, and unarmed Akai Gurley. These are state-sponsored massacres of our people, massacres enabled by a long history of national and global anti-Blackness. As members of the academic discipline with a distinctive history of establishing the language and science of race to justify settler colonialism and slavery, we recognize full well that the root of today's anti-Black state-sponsored violence in the U.S. is white supremacy. We know that our discipline played a significant role in developing the trope of a particular Black subject, the urban Black, or what sociology likes to call the culture and pathology of poverty, that has been deployed by society at large to dehumanize Black people. At the same time, we also realize that our discipline has been tepid in fruitfully acknowledging and addressing its own white supremacist foundations. We therefore call on our colleagues in the American Anthropological Association to join us in not only condemning this history, but also affirming that Black lives matter. Beyond the role, that Black lives matter beyond the role of ethnographic subjects and cultural vessels. We call on our colleagues in anthropology to stand against the U.S. state's terrorism against Black and brown peoples. We call on our colleagues to join us in demanding redress and restitution with expediency. As anthropologist Zora Neale Hurston is known to have said, if you are silent about your pain, they will kill you and say you enjoyed it. We will not be silent. For members of the American Anthropological Association to be silent at this time, given our discipline's historic complicity in establishing the current order, and when we have the means to make a difference, is criminal. To this end, we have 3 demands. We call on the executive board of the AAA to issue a formal statement that condemns the heinousness of these crimes and calls on our academic guilds to more forcefully tackle the problems brought on by racism and racial profiling. We ask that the executive board make every effort to make the statement accessible to the general public through mainstream media outlets so that the discipline's stance and investment in these efforts can be widely known. 2, we call on our colleagues to join the ABA in challenging the power position from which we produce anthropology. 3, we join with other anthropologists and stand in solidarity with people from around the country and calling on the U.S. Department of Justice to review the use of force by police and to make a commitment to working for the eradication of racism and racialized state violence. End quote. So that was a statement that we released as the association. I'll relay your applause. I became an anthropologist because this discipline always felt like the best place to use life experiences and personal narratives to provide contextualization and shed light on a variety of truths. While you may not agree with or understand others' rage, sadness, or frustration in this moment, isn't it our responsibility as anthropologists to at least begin to try? If we, who are trained in ethnographic methods such as participant observation, who value being on the ground and in the field, whose disciplinary mission is to understand human beings, culture, and traditions, are not interested in figuring out why there's a troubling and explicit racial divide in how our nation is experiencing this moment of injustice, then who will? We need to have more conversations about race and racism instead of promoting a colorblind approach to living in this moment. Because for many people of color, particularly Black and brown folks, transcending their race is not an option when they are met with bullets, tear gas, batons, chokeholds, or bombs. At over 140 days of national organizing, protest, and action, this movement against anti-Black practices and police violence, the Black Lives Matter movement, is the second longest movement in U.S. history. It is second only to the Montgomery bus boycott during the Civil Rights Movement. As I have engaged in discussions with folks and organized in Denver with groups such as Denver Freedom Riders, several questions consistently come up, and I will spend the rest of my time addressing some of these frequently asked questions, FAQs, so we can use Q&A today to move past these issues or questions. One question always comes up is, what's the connection between Ferguson and Denver? Why should Denver care about what's happening in Ferguson? And my answer is systemic and institutional issues such as lack of diverse curricula in K-12 and higher education, unequal access to academic institutions, resources to maintain enrollment in these institutions, educational and housing segregation, the school to prison pipeline, a lack of job opportunities, etc., are affecting cities and rural areas across the U.S. While these issues affect Ferguson and Denver, they sometimes affect them in different ways. I think Dr. Potter can kind of speak to some of that. A recent report claims that the Denver Police Department is one of the most brutal police forces in the country. It's in the top 10. In the last 26 days, at least 3 people under the age of 30 have been killed in Denver, people of color, and police have been involved in the incidents. An unarmed queer Latino was killed yesterday morning. While the details of these cases are still to be sorted out, and the evidence may show that police took necessary action in self-defense, the fact is that the deaths of Black and brown people are becoming a fact of life for many in Denver and Boulder communities, and we need to take this seriously. The second question is, what does success look like? What are your list of demands? Why are you guys so angry? We the Protesters is a great kind of digital hub. They have a US map, and if you click on the map, you can see the demands of all the people organizing in that state. That's a great place to go if you're interested in kind of what people are asking for. A lot of these demands are related to education, to having communities have more interaction with the police forces in their communities so that communities have some accountability and participation in the policing in their communities, and also greater participation in civil processes, having the right to vote, equal rights to vote, etc. 2 more. What's the difference between this movement and the movement that is portrayed in Selma? We've all apparently seen the movie, and now people are like, well, what's the difference? I would say that this movement is different in some ways, but it is a continuation of that movement. So in Selma, they were organizing particularly for the right to vote and to enforce desegregation. We can see from the contemporary moment that even when we have the right to vote and we have laws and books that desegregate, we still have issues. So we're kind of getting deeper, the next stage of that movement. And the last one, Dr. Potter kind of already covered, is the whole, you guys are saying Black lives matter, don't all lives matter. That is a given. That is a place, that is a beginning. That is where we're starting. Yes, all lives do matter. That is clear. But it's also clear that there are more Black and brown bodies on the ground. There are more Black and brown bodies being killed in their houses. And so clearly all Black lives, queer, trans, women, youth, they all matter. And the other thing I want to point out is that we oftentimes forget that the people who are running the stuff in Ferguson, who are organizing, who are running the organization in Ferguson, are queer, women, youth. And so the difference between this movement and the previous movement is that those people are at the forefront, and they're leading it. And so Christians, men, heterosexual folk are trying to figure out how to deal with their issues so that they can follow the people who are leading this movement. Thank you.
Well, I think we've had 3 absolutely fascinating presentations, and I would like to, we don't have chairs. This room has a dearth of chairs that move. So maybe I could ask the 3 speakers to sort of lean against the table, and we will take, yes. Thank you. I'd like to take questions from the floor. The very back.
Talk about life's experiences. I still remember perception. I still remember the picture in Clinton's office when they announced the results of the O.J. Simpson trial. The pictures between blacks and the white were pretty disparate. Is racism only a white man's disease?
Do you each want to give a short answer to that?
Yes.
Oh, the question.
No.
For those who
No, I
couldn't hear.
I was answering yes to you, but seriously.
Just let me repeat the question
Oh.
because the acoustics aside. The question was, is racism only a white man's disease?
Because whites are in power, they are the ones that have the power to be racist. Sometimes, even when we have our posters that say Black Lives Matter, we're accused of being racist. But if technically, I mean, yeah, maybe in some sense, there could be some racism that I, as a Black woman, could have against someone. But when we look at the deeper academic explanation of what racism is, power is part of racism. I do not have the power to be racist. Black people do not have the power to be racist. It's the people who are in charge who are racist. Now, I can be biased in a lot of different ways, right? And there are things that even in my job that I could do to hold against you because of your race. But as far as racism, which is a strong structural, socio-structural concept that is laden with power, it is something that white people do need to work on, and it is something that white people started. White people were the ones who invented this problem of race. And Eduardo Bonilla Silva talks a lot about that.
What she said. Plus, I would give an example to illustrate how I understand the way that power works in racism, which is that, I don't know, I think it was back in December, Nicholas Kristof in the New York Times wrote an article to try to help white people to engage in some kind of empathetic imagination, right? To do the imaginative exercise that I'm trying to encourage people to do, sort of imagining what it's like to be, to see the world from this other perspective. But his imaginative exercise was, written to white people, right? Imagine that Black people are in charge of the police and the government and so on and so forth, and you're really worried about your son going out in his polo shirt and being targeted for wearing a polo shirt. And that, right, that, like, the idea that the polo shirt was the flip side or the equivalent of a hoodie, right, to me just shows how vacuous it is to try to reverse the scales and act as if racism goes the other way around. And there's no way in which a polo shirt, or trying to imagine my son being targeted for wearing a polo shirt, has the same kind of visceral energy around it that thinking about how a hoodie, right, marks a Black man as a criminal does. Right? We don't associate the clothing for white people in the same way. And so you can't just reverse the power hierarchy and plug in a different color and make it work in the same way.
I'm trying to be quick. Whenever people talk about it as a disease for white people, I get a little cringe. I pull away from that a little bit because disease implies that it's an individual problem. And I think what I try to teach in my classes, again, is that so race and racism are not the same thing. Race is the category that you are labeled in the system of power that is racism. So racism is the system of distribution of resources, economic power, political power, etc. I don't have a problem with race. I plan on being Black to the day I die. An issue like labeling myself as race, I don't have that issue. The issue that I have is that when you take my Blackness and place a value on it and place judgment on it and stereotypes on it, and that is what the system of racism does. So there's a difference between those two things. So when people are trying to be colorblind, I'm really confused because I'm like, clearly I see you. Like if a woman was raped, women would be like, I don't know what happened to her because I don't see that she's a woman. Like I don't understand that thinking. Like that doesn't make any sense. So it's not race that's the problem. It's the system of racism that is the problem. And so if it's a disease, it's a systemic and institutionalized disease, which makes it so difficult to get rid of. And my example that I usually use is like, Black men have a hard time catching a cab in New York, right? Now, yes, as a Black cab driver, I could decide that today I'm not picking up any white people, right? And that would be my way of getting back at the man. That would be prejudice. That would be bias. But the white man who I don't pick up can go to any other cab that's around and still get a cab, right? So the Black man that has a hard time getting a cab in New York gets a hard time from every taxi driver that's going, regardless of their race. That is the difference between Black people supposedly being engaging in reverse racism, which we don't have the power to do, and white people participating and perpetuating white supremacy, which is at the heart of racism.
Thank you very much for all your presentations. I grew up in Ferguson in the 1970s, about a mile from the place where Michael Brown was shot. I've been following the news closely, one could say obsessively, and I'm working on a memoir. I had been working on a memoir about growing up in hyper-segregated St. Louis as a white girl, and this gave my own work new urgency. I think what disturbed me the most about the Michael Brown shooting was the fact that Michael Brown's body was left on the ground for 4.5 hours. It felt immediately to me like a lynching, but there's been very little commentary about that. And I was struck when Bob McCullough, the prosecuting attorney, made his announcement about the non-indictment of Darren Wilson. He never mentioned or discussed or acknowledged that Michael Brown's body was left on the ground for 4.5 hours. So I'm wondering what any of you make of that fact, and if it resonates with you in terms of the history of lynching. We can move down to it.
Yeah, definitely. There are so many things about this entire case that are reminiscent of times past, of situations in the past, and just feels as Dr. Williams spoke about just our bodies, that the way our bodies, our Black bodies, are treated differently, and that they're less than, that there's something inherently wrong with our bodies, and inherently of less value compared with others, with whites and blacks.
I think there was a lot of discussion kind of inside Black media and comparing that, but it didn't get kind of mainstream media. And I think definitely the 4.5 hours, and a lot of die-ins are 4.5 minutes as a symbol to that 4.5 hours, is part of what is triggering kind of the rage that you see in the streets. It's this idea that, you know, this is a human being, this is somebody's son, his parents were across the street, were not allowed to even go near the body for 4.5 hours. They're just standing there watching it, right, with the entire community. And even yesterday, the queer Latino who was killed yesterday, police reported that this person was killed because they were using the car to hit police officers. And we still won't know the details. I mean, we may never know the details of that. But what is reported is that after this person was killed, they were handcuffed after they were shot and turned over on their stomach and bleeding out, and were searched as they were bleeding out. And again, to me, that's like, how do you not see our humanity, right? I would vouch to say that if it was white boys and white girls, or white women and white men in the street, being handcuffed after you're shot and turned over your stomach to be searched in front of your community is problematic, right? So how do we even connect and empathize with the bodies that are on the ground, right?
What do we know now about the best antidotes and activism versus ineffective antidotes and activism in terms of dealing with the problem?
The question was, what do we know about what is effective and ineffective activism?
One thing that, because there have also been, Dr. Williams mentioned a few of them, just the complaints and the things that we get asked. One thing, you know, what's stopping traffic going to do? What's protesting on the Capitol steps, you know, in front of the Ferguson, well, close as you can get to the Ferguson Police Department, across the street from there. What is that going to do? What are these marches going to do? Well, they bring awareness, and especially if we are stopping commerce, if we are doing what we can do to get your attention, and if it means that we need to go into a mall and disrupt service so that we get your attention by disrupting your dollar or your pleasant Sunday trying to shop and you spend your money, then that's what it takes. But at the same time, it has to be multifaceted, right? So that is one small portion of it. It's just that is in the mainstream, so-called mainstream or corporate media. That's the main piece that's being covered because that's the attention that we're getting. But it is a multifaceted, it needs to be a multifaceted response, and that's what it is. It's just it's are not being covered. So there's a lot of work that's going on behind the scenes. I was going to say underground, not really underground, just behind the scenes from the media at a grassroots level, looking at all these different issues, all these different levels of how we need to affect change. And that does include not only it being blacks who are involved, it being all people of color, it being whites as well, white allies, particularly because for some whites, they're not going to listen to me. They're not going to listen to folks who look like me. If they already think a certain way about me, that I am below them, then why would they listen to me? And so in many of those cases, we understand that it's going to take whites to talk to whites to get them to a place where they can empathize. It's about legislation, affecting legislation, and so we're doing what we need to do on that level. It's about changing who has a seat at the table, so to say. So one of the things that I've been doing since 2009, I sit on I'm a commissioner, one of 5 commissioners for the Denver Civil Service Commission. So me and the other 4 commissioners are second to last to decide who becomes a police officer or firefighter in Denver. Believe it or not, me and my activist self, I do that as well. So I was appointed by them, a mayoral appointment, so I'm appointed as a community member. So even that, right, getting in there, as much as we complain about the system, that's important as well, as to get in there and do what we can so that we can let people know. So for some people, our education and trying to educate others. For some people, there is some intent. They know what they're doing. They realize, their racist views or whatever the case may be. But a lot of people, it is some level of ignorance. And so it's, and then there are many other things. So multifaceted.
I think part of it depends on what it is that you want to achieve, right? What your goals are. And, you mentioned many different kinds of goals. And so we could talk about best tactics for achieving all sorts of different goals. But I think one of the things that Dr. Potter didn't mention that I would really want to highlight that's been effective about the protests in New York City in particular is drawing out how much the police force there does not want the protests, right? Does not actually recognize the protesting as a legitimate democratic activity, right? But sees its role as clamping down on democratic voice. And to me, showing using that kind of activism in order to show the truth about the people who are in power and what it is that they're willing to tolerate and what they're not, I think is an incredible benefit of that kind of activism. And so that's your goal. I think in New York they've done that tremendously well.
My quick add would be that coalition building and alliance building across differences is really important. And so learning how to talk about race or, learning how to talk about homophobia and heteronormativity and all these things and use it as coalition building is really important. Showing up for justice is having a training on, there are white folks who train white folks how to do organizing with people of color. They're going to be here in the education department next week, Thursday. So they're on campus if anybody wants to go get that training. And the other thing I'll add is that institutional and systemic progress and change is very slow. And so I think many times I see younger activists get really impatient and they don't realize that this is very slow change. So I would say have patience, know how to talk to people who are ignorant but trying, have patience with people, have patience with yourself, and take care of yourself. Self-care is a revolutionary act, as our Lord says. Take care of yourself.
Yes.
I'm an educator, and I believe that it's so important to change people's worldview in so many areas. But I keep thinking about the police officers, and they're there with the power, making all these difficult decisions every day about who's right and who's wrong, and what somebody's doing and what somebody's not doing. And I'm sure I would think probably most of them are really trying to do their best. And then there are also people that go into the field that are bullies and shouldn't be in it, just like with any profession. You have bad people in the career. But I'm wondering, I haven't heard anybody talking about giving training and educating and helping police officers to become more sensitive and to get it. They need it, just like teachers need training
that's been going on for like, well before Michael Brown, with efforts trying to be made in that area. There have been improved efforts across the United States in different police departments and different academies, whether it's actual police department's academy or if it's say like a community college has their own academy where you can go and get that training for that. So that's something that we've pushed for some time, and we still and we've seen improvements. So particularly like in area of intimate partner abuse, domestic violence, we've seen improvement in them getting training in that area. But as we usually want more of that, and we want more effective training in that particular area. So that is one of the, I just think to mention that is one of the elements as well, is to make sure, first of all, that we get good people in these positions. And you're right, there are many people who are in the position or have a police officer post, and they're doing great work. They're really connecting with the community. They're seeing the community as they're seeing themselves as part of that community. They see themselves as peace officers more than police officers, which they have to, even if they still have to wear all the protective gear and have the firearm and everything, still seeing themselves as peace officers and actually talking to, getting out of their cruisers, getting off their bikes or their horses or whatever they be on, and speaking with the people just to say hello and not only contacting them when there's a problem. So there are some good folks out there, and there are efforts that have been made and that continue to be made to try to make that connection and to join forces where the community can have a conversation with the local police department about issues of training and ongoing training, not just the training in the academy.
I think it's important to remember, and Dr. Potter has mentioned this a little bit, but this kind of activism and organizing around community relationships with police and police violence and so on has been going on for a very long time. And just because Ferguson, erupts on the national scene doesn't mean that that's the first time any of this work has been happening. But one of the real benefits, I think, of the sustained attention to the problem that's come out of the movement, right, keeping the media paying attention to it, is that there's much more of a conversation nationally about who is in the police force, right, and how representative a given police force is of the community that it's policing. And then also, to come back to Dr. Potter's point about gender, right, thinking about having more female police officers, because statistically, female police officers are less likely to engage in violence with somebody that they might be apprehending than men. Right? And so if you want to decrease the rate of violence, right, that's one possible way to go about it.
I think what's kind of sad in this moment when you have, I can't imagine being a police officer in this moment. But they're human beings, just like we are, right? And I think part of my mission in teaching and why I do my research is that, I always tell my students, you guys are the ones who will become police officers. You guys will be the ones who become politicians. And so it's your job now to kind of deconstruct and get rid of all of that racist, homophobic, class elite stuff now. Because we put you in a job and you can do that job differently if you already know those things as a human being. What's been sad in this kind of dichotomous relationship, or the way that the police and the groups that they are policing are held apart from one another in mainstream media, is that oftentimes the police officers are from those communities, right? Or the police officers oftentimes have shared economic interests, right? And shared political interests. And so it's not like many police officers are of the middle and upper class. Like, they're from those poor and working class neighborhoods. And so not many people are having conversations about how the people that are being policed and the police officers have a lot of shared interests. And so creating more dialogue with those groups would be useful.
And if I could add just one more thing really quickly, just on a practical point. So the Civil Service Commission, when a police officer in Denver, firefighters don't really seem to get in trouble, but with a police officer in Denver, it's been one since I've been on the commission. So when something happens, right, there's some, whether it's, we see it in the media because we're not necessarily directly contacted, or if it's a case that, because we also don't deal with appeals, if it reaches our level after being dealt with within the department, we deal with appeals for disciplinary reasons for police and firefighters for Denver. And so what we'll do is when we see that, we ask the staff at the commission to pull the applicant's, not the applicant's actual worker, but the file when the person was a candidate, And we go through it and we read it and we try to see, is there anything in this file that we could have, foresaw this particular event occurring a few years later. And every time we've done that, because we've only done the past few years, past like 3 years, where we've had that little practice going on, we haven't seen anything in there that would have like forewarned us to that issue. So we definitely also need to figure out ways. And one of it is just ways to groom people into those jobs as we grow up, but figuring out ways to, are there other ways to detect, which I don't really know. I mean, that's with a lot of things we can't see.
A couple more questions on the floor. So this gentleman over here.
Okay. I recognize that, racism is exclusively a class problem, but I do notice in my circles, which are mostly socialist and communist, that we like to talk about class. And as far as the studying that I've managed to do, I see a lot of class division in the effort that created racism. So I'm really wondering if we could talk a little bit more about how to properly talk about class and racism, and that I might take it back to my comrades and be able to talk about it not as, the solution that crosses out racism, but as the support that allows racism to also be challenged.
I don't know I have to answer for that one, but I will tell you that what I do try to teach is that racism and usually patriarchy are in service of classism, right? Class exploitation, particularly in the system of capitalism. So it helps people understand that if racism is a system of distributing economic and political resources, then race and gender are the utility of that, right? Or the things that are used. I was watching Sag Harbor. Did anyone see that last night on network? It's a show about Black upper class people who go to the Hamptons and live in the Hamptons. And I was watching it. I was thinking, it's so funny. Americans can never tell you if they're part of the middle class or upper middle class. We have no literacy in having real discussions about class. And it may be because we spend so much time trying to talk about race and to try to talk about patriarchy, which feel really elusive. We can't tell you. We have no language, vocabulary, tools to really engage in everyday discussions about classism or class exploitation. And I think it's something that we have to kind of focus on. I don't know if that's helpful for you. Sorry.
So the discussions about class that I was referencing, I actually think from a Marxist perspective would count as ideology, right? That is saying it's not race, it's class. It's a way of actually reassuring the people who are in a higher socioeconomic status that racism isn't going to affect me, right? And there's a parallel when it comes to sexism, right? If I made it to CU, then sexism is a thing of the past, right? Because how could I possibly be here if sexism is still a problem, right? And so it's a story that gets told in order to reassure myself that I'm not going to become the victim of that kind of profile. Right? And that's where I think it could actually, the discussion of class that I'm thinking about is actually not a sophisticated socialist kind of discussion like the one that you just gave us, but rather it's a way of masking over what's really going on.
Outside of that, because I don't think Charles Murray is actually going to do much about classism and class division. And I'm trying to do something about that. I don't know how to do that. I'm not seeing to cross it off. I don't want to cross it off.
It's just important to remember that it's all connected as well. Class racism, that's what the whole intersectionality buzz is about.
I'm going to take 2 more questions, and then I'm sure our panelists will be willing to talk to people they want to come up after.
Yes, I have this one very burning question regarding the Ferguson case. First of all, I'm not an American. I mean, I came here, I got married as an adult and all that. So I came from Malaysia, where it's multicultural, 3 races, and I didn't grow up hearing such stories. I don't think we will ever have that because the police will not be able to get it, But So this is based on what I understand because of the national protest and all that. So I got really intrigued. I mean, I never really pay attention to such things just because I'm Chinese, you know, I'm not black, no white, and all that. So this is based on what I read in the newspaper about Darren Wilson, the police who shot, right? Based on his interview and what you call the special prosecution's report and all that. Based on that, so I wanted to know what really happened. So what I know is from those accounts, interviews. So what I understood was, so basically this points to what about this law-abiding behavior, peaceful behavior? And because I understand, like Darren Wilson was asking Trevor Martin, whatever his name is, Michael Brown, he was walking on the wrong side of the street, whatever, you know, and then just asking to stay off the street, something like that. Apparently it started like that, you know, and then Michael Brown came to the window, and then I don't know, there was this dispute, and then he grabbed the officer's gun and all that and went off. So my point was, and then I guess he went away, he left, and then the officer felt that he had to chase him or something, you know, because he read in the meantime he had a penny theft at the store or something. But my burning question was, if Michael Brown had listened, you know, to the police officer telling him to stay off the street, to walk on the pavement, in other words, what a law-abiding, peaceful citizen would be, how I would act. I would be afraid of the police officer, you know, I would just do whatever he asked. Right. So I'm thinking, would this have happened, you know, would it have been escalated to this point? So meaning that if Michael Brown had behaved, you know, right. That's my question.
What actions led to what actions?
Yeah, and that the police officer maybe just did what he had to do, you know.
Right. So we only have a couple of minutes left. Do you have any very short?
Well, first of all, the contact to begin with.
Sorry?
Before that even happened, about Michael Brown doing what the officer asked him to do, was that initial contact necessary? If that would have been in a different neighborhood, it was two white boys walking in the middle of the street that wasn't a main thoroughfare, a street that, you know, was a curvy road, you know, so if it was the same setting in a different suburb, would those boys have even been contacted? So, okay, but there was contact.
He was singled out because he was black? I don't know, you know, I mean, he was singled out because
that's the question. That's the question. That's the hypothesis.
So, but he was contacted. So, you know, we don't know. There's a lot of what ifs, if-thens. If Michael Brown and his friend Dorian would have got on the sidewalk, we don't know, right? Yeah. Because we still don't even know, like, some of the details.
Sorry, and to me that was provocative action on his part, you know, to grab the gun.
I'm taking out of your question. So one is, as anthropologists at least, what we're trying to connect this moment of state-sanctioned violence and police violence to is that it is a global issue. So there are cases in Malaysia of state-sanctioned violence, police violence, maybe not in the same context because we have definitely different like economic, social, and political businesses. But all this stuff is a global issue around power and authority and white supremacy. The other thing is that what we learned from stories like Charles Blow and Kiese Layman and other people who are coming out with stories is that there is no law-abiding behavior that's going to protect you from getting killed if you're a black or brown person. There is no middle-class practice. I can be behavior in the context of racism that's going to protect me from possibly getting killed. It may seem like there is, but we know every day with all the deaths that are happening from black women, black men, and trans people, that there is nothing that's going to do that because of the face of racism. It's not because these people are necessarily evil. Sorry, it's that because of racism.
So one more question over here.
Sure. I'm also from St. Louis, and I'm from a totally white area. I went to a school that was mixed, and we called it the DSEG program. Yep, that's for teachers, kids, everybody. And I really didn't see racism. Like, I didn't see it until I left home. You came to Boulder. I've lived in a few places at this point. I just got back to Boulder. But now I see it like a ton of bricks. I mean, every time I'm in the airport, it's just it's a visceral thing. But I really, really didn't feel it. And I wasn't a hateful child, and I didn't grow up with mean parents, or that wasn't a family value or a community value. And I'm around a lot of people like that still in my world, who really don't see it at all. And I think we're in a unique time in my community. It's like there's new openings. People are starting to see things a little bit, like the waves are getting there. But a lot of the people in the world I come from, they don't have to, live near the protests. Like, you don't, you feel it a little bit, but if you're not watching that news station, like, you don't have to be exposed to it. And I guess my question to you would be, I'm like dying to help facilitate conversations and start it. I think this is a really special time, and that population is hard to reach. I guess any tips? I know one of you lovely doctors recommended like books and stuff like that, but as far as conversation starters, like any resources or big books that you recommend? Tim Wise reference.
Yeah, there's a short post. I don't know if either of you would know this, but that someone put up about how to be a white ally in the white community.
Yeah, 12 things white people can do.
If you look for some combination of those words, you'll find it. It's like a list of 10 things that you can do.
David Letter from the University of Washington and Michaele McKenzie.
This lady knows words.
Yeah, I know what it's called. 12 things white people can do now that are after Ferguson. Yeah.
It was okay version.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
12 things white people can do now. Google it.
And then Tim Wise, find short, if you're talking about trying to reach your people, short like YouTube videos of Tim Wise and some other folks like that, speaking about these issues, just like keeping it, keep sharing it in that way, because that tends to particularly to see those videos, especially if you can't sit them down to read his work and others.
So before I draw this to a close, I'm sorry, there's lots of hands still up. I'm going to allow this gentleman one public service announcement very quickly.
There's an answer to your question. There's an answer to your question right here, and that is please come get involved with the Boulder Coalition Against Racism. We'll have a meeting every month. We have one this Friday night, I believe. You're here, the leader is not here, but at any rate, we're trying to enact exactly some of these things.
Where is it?
And if you come down here and give me your email, I'm not sure where the location is going to be this week. If you give me your email, I'll shoot you back an email later telling you exactly where and what time it's going to be this week.
Did you write your email on the board? Would that be okay?
Sure. Yeah.
There's chalk at the center. So while the gentleman's doing that, I would like to thank you all for coming. I'd like to thank our 3 speakers, and I think we all deserve a great round of applause.